It's been joked about on hit TV shows like Outsourced or on The Office, when one of the main characters debated about whether China or the United States was the #1 superpower in the world. But it looks like that confusion extends to real life. A new survey shows that only 1 in 5 Americans believes that the U.S. economy is the world's strongest, while half the people polled say that China's economy is in fact the strongest. Many Americans are starting to believe that competition from China will negatively affect their quality of lives, leading many to wonder what the next few years has in store for the United States. Well, joining me to help discuss this is J.P. Friere. He's the associate editor of commentary at the Washington Examiner. And we're also going to have another guest joining us from our New York studios. That's Joseph Weisenthal. He's the deputy editor of Business Insider. But let's start with you, JP, since you're here right now. Are these numbers really a shock? I mean, some people might say, hey, maybe this is a good thing that Americans are starting to question their superiority, and maybe this will cause people to face reality and actually think about solutions to get the country back on track. What's your take?
I think that most Americans know how to get the country back on track. I mean, people know how to take care of themselves. I mean, the reason that China is China is actually worse when it comes to stratification. I mean, you look at how their government leadership is actually able to live fairly lavishly, but then the rest of the peasants don't get to live all that well. That's not a consequence of capitalism. That's not a consequence of people getting rich. That's a consequence of not enabling people to actually create wealth, which is something that's possible in this country. And I just love that you just had a guest on who, has already been on Wall Street for what he said, 30 years, has already made his millions of dollars. He still works for a financial firm, and he's talking about how, now it's more like a casino. What? I mean, he's still there. He's still working on it. It's because he's making money. I mean, and the truth is that in this country, you are actually able to get a foothold, and you can, if you're allowed by government regulation, to start a small business or to start some venture where you can create capital, and that's good.
Joseph, what about you? What do you think? Were these numbers really a shock to you, and do you think it's a good thing maybe that Americans are starting to realize that China's on the rise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good that we're aware of where China is and everything. I don't think it's, I don't think we should be worried about it necessarily. I think there are certain aspects of China's rise that will pose a challenge. I think the effect on commodities and the search for oil, stuff like that, will certainly have an impact on, our economy. But I don't think it should necessarily be a worry or something we should be scared of.
Well, it seems like a lot of Americans are worried that, because China's economy is growing, that's going to have an impact on their quality of lives and the rate that their salaries could increase in the future, because now they're competing in more of a globalized world against lower paid workers in other countries. Is that something that Americans should be worried about? Is China's growing economy a direct correlation, or can that be directly correlated to Americans' decreasing quality of life, JP?
I mean, I think that Americans' quality of life has increased because we've had historically such a great economy that we could leverage so that we could get great trade agreements with countries like China. I mean, people have benefited from that. If you ever go to a store that sells goods that are manufactured in other countries, people are able to get them cheaper. Now, does that mean that it might hurt our manufacturing? It actually could, but the way that you fix that is by you enable manufacturing to really take a rise in this country. I mean, we tell everybody you need to go to a 4-year college, and we don't encourage people to go to trade schools. We accuse for-profit universities of being too self-aggrandizing as opposed to turning out people that can actually create stuff. I mean, if we want this economy to compete with China's and to do well, we should probably enable workers to do what they should be doing.
And Joseph, in the poll, Americans did express optimism in certain areas, the U.S. workforce, corporate leaders, and education in the fields of science and technology. What does the United States need to do to remain competitive with a country like China? Should they focus on improving these things?
Yeah, I think what JP said is basically exactly correct. I think we should look at, it's not about, a zero-sum game necessarily, whether China is winning in the manufacturing war and we're losing, but we should look at areas where we're not competitive. And it would appear that we have this problem where we have a lot of the population, which for whatever reason isn't fit or isn't inclined to go to a 4-year school and go into information work or, work in an office. And yet on the lower end of job availabilities, we're not thinking about what we can do to be more competitive reducing our own costs, whether it's the bureaucratic aspects that are hampering manufacturing or labor laws or environmental laws. And so we should actually think about what we can do to really open up and make more competitive some of those lower-end industries. Again, not because making stuff per se is the route to prosperity, but more because we have a large chunk of the population that's what they'll be well suited for.
Yeah, I was about to ask you guys, what areas do you think the United States needs to improve on to remain competitive with a country like China? One thing that the people in the poll said was they believe that the United States lags behind in primary and secondary education. Are there other examples that you think the United States needs to work on?
I mean, lagging behind in primary and secondary education is huge, but of course we don't want to have the Chinese model. I actually don't know what the Chinese model would be, but we want one that embraces our sort of cultural character, which is more school choice, more charter schools, things that enable people to if they have an interest in something early on, to be encouraged and pursue that, and also to provide varying people with varying degrees of intelligence and varying degrees of skills to pursue the things that they have those skill sets for, and that's something that we're not doing in this country.
And it's interesting too, I mentioned the show Outsourced as kind of a joke, but most of the Americans in the poll said that outsourcing negatively impacts the United States economy, but only 1/5 said that they worry that their job will be sent overseas. Joseph, do you think what's going on here? There seems to be a disconnect between perception of what's going on and reality.
Yeah, and I think you often see that in polls. I mean, people often think that they're above average of intelligence, or that they make more than the average person or whatnot. So there might just be some kind of bias where, if you're doing fine in life and you have a job and you're comfortable, then you presume that you're above average. So I don't know necessarily what that says. That being said, I don't think anyone really knows what's going to be outsourced or not. All kinds of jobs that we may have previously thought were unoutsourceable knowledge labor has been outsourced. I mean, obviously the sort of medium to low end of the tech industry, computer programming, stuff like that, stuff that we were guaranteed wasn't the kind of job that could be easily outsourced has. So, in terms of, I don't think anyone knows. It's a tough guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because when you talk about outsourcing, you obviously think about India, a country that I've traveled to very frequently. And President Obama was recently there, and he said, hey, Americans, you think about India as stealing American jobs, but there's also 1 billion people here and a growing middle class, and we should really think about marketing our products to them. They're, a new consumer group that we hadn't really considered in decades past. Why don't more Americans think about that, JP?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about encouraging jobs in this country, encouraging people to actually pursue things that will create actual wealth, you look at the shrinkage of jobs in the private sector, and then you look at the huge increase in the number of jobs in the public sector, and then you realize sort of what's going on here, that there's sort of this grab mentality happening among union labor, among government officials, people that just think, okay, well, we can use taxpayer dollars to plug these holes so that that'll be a part of the economy that we don't have to worry about anymore. Unfortunately, it just leads to inefficiency. It doesn't actually create wealth. It's just redistribution, and it's not going to really get us out of this hole.
And really quickly, Joseph, what's the answer for the United States to be able to compete in kind of a globalized world? A lot of Americans in the survey said they kind of wanted a protectionist model where the United States closes its doors and makes all of its products in America and brings back the manufacturing jobs here. Why do people seem to think that's a good idea instead of maybe trying to become more competitive?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess there's an obvious appeal of kind of going the easy route, and this idea that, well, if we just tax, foreign companies or reduce imports, then naturally the jobs will just spring up in the United States. And I guess to me that seems like a shortcut, and the economics sort of strictly says that's not going to work. Before we do anything that drastic, I think there's a lot we can do to just, as you say, become more competitive, whether it's, eliminating a lot of the red tape and regulations that hamper homegrown industries. The tax code could be simplified to a great degree, things like that. So before we, go down this trade war idea, there are a lot of simple things we could do to improve our economy that just getting on an even playing field with our own regulations.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Americans' perceptions change in the future if they think that the United States will retain its superpower status. I appreciate the analysis from both of you guys. That was Joseph Weisenthal, Deputy Editor of Business Insider, and JP Friere, Associate Editor of Commentary for the Washington Examiner.
Thanks.